there's like this idea that there's a turn away from the material and the analog, and there's a turn towards the digital and to have everything virtual. But I actually would argue that what makes us human is our relationships with the material world. Primarily each other. If I wasn't here right now addressing you, you would not be human in a sense. You need another to recognize you as human in order to be. And it's the same with objects. The objects that we interact with, they make us human. And the virtual and the digital, for me, take something away from that. Like performing online, it's not the same. And why is it not the same? Because you don't smell, see, taste the person in front of you. You don't feel their emotion because you're playing to a screen. That's the same with digital music for me, and why analog records are so important. My name's Sam Longford. I am a co-owner of the space we are in now, the Commons, which we envisage it as a public space for the arts and to support the arts. And my interviewer today, Joe Cunningham, for example, has played in our plays a couple of times. And we just try and fill the space with music and art, and also try and push back against the usual way of holding public space. Obviously we know how Cape Town works and how segregated it is and how exclusionary it is. And I guess the four of us came here with the same ideas about wanting to do something different and making it available for lots of different people to use and to feel safe and to feel welcome. But on top of that, I am a PhD fellow at the Centre for Humanities Research at University of the Western Cape. I'm doing my PhD at the History Department about Chris Hani, his assassination, the ways in which he's remembered and memorialised today, and questions about what it means to live on in the wake of apartheid and its violence. I also run a project at the department called Remaking Persons, Remaking Societies, which is essentially called a supranational project, partnering with University of Ghana Legon, University of Makerere in Uganda, American University Cairo, American University Beirut. And the idea is broadly based on the question of repatriation of stolen museum objects and the recovery of the dead and missing of atrocities across Africa and the globe. So I guess I do a lot of things. Before the Commons, I was purely focused on academia. I spent about 65% of my time there. And obviously after the pandemic, I was no longer on campus. And I think every academic knows how it feels to lose that sense of community. And this opportunity arose, and me and Kola originally came in to use the space and to put on music and see what we could do and experiment in the social. So that's why I'm here. It's very happenstance. I didn't plan it. I thought I would be in academia my whole life, and maybe I will. But yeah, it's nice to dabble in things outside of the ivory tower, so to speak. Kind of in industrialized capitalist societies, there's a certain disconnect between, I don't want to call it an essence, or like a culture of music production. And I think you were arguing along the lines that, in communities that maybe aren't as much in the ambit or orbit of kind of industrialized capitalist societies, there is still that sense of community around music and around the arts. And I remember that you said that as a musician in Cape Town, for example, you're a professional. You are known for playing the trumpet, someone else is known for playing the drums. They're a professional musician, and that is their craft, that is their labor. Right? As opposed to what you were saying about how in other spaces everyone is a musician. Everyone can pick up a drum, everyone can pick up a horn and play, and there's no kind of hierarchy of labour. And I think that's what started making me think about the commodification of labour. Because I'm an academic before a musician, I've always been interested in music, I've always played music. I don't play an instrument, but I'm an avid listener. I love the history of music, tradition. And I guess I was coming at it from a perspective of academic labour, intellectual labour. Because we usually think of labour in terms of the man who digs the ditch, or the labourer the guy who goes down the mines. That's kind of the conventional way in which we think labour, and that's the ways in which Marx talked about it, for example. And when I always talk about labour, although I'm not an expert, I always go to Marxism and what Marx said about the division of labour and how it's organised in capitalist societies. So yeah, it's interesting how, I guess what made me comment about the commodification of labour is how in the academy, for example, we've just been talking about publications. That it's always been, traditionally, it's obviously an exclusionary space, especially in South Africa. Traditionally, it was always, mainly preserved for white South Africans. And it's always been traditionally seen as a space of thinking rather than labouring. We academics think and we teach, and then the people we teach go out into the world and hopefully do good things with that, right? They get qualifications, etc. But traditionally it's not seen in terms of labour. And I guess that what I was getting at is and this speaks to musicians as well, especially how you'd be very lucky to just make music for the fun of it. Everyone has to make money. So in a sense, your talent and your expertise with an instrument gets commoditized because you have to make a living. So you have to come to a place like the Commons, although obviously you might enjoy coming to the Commons more than other places in town. You have to sell your labour, and it gets commoditized, and you become you have to market yourself in the same way that in academia, to get a job, you need to publish. Right, and usually publishing is seen as the production of knowledge, the expansion of knowledge, sharing knowledge between the institution and others in the public domain. But essentially, with the capitalization and commoditization of the university itself, they need to make money. And we know that when you or I publish something in an article, the university receives money for it. So that's one of the reasons why, I think probably an underlooked reason in most spaces, one of the reasons why you have to publish in order to get a job, because they know that you're going to be able to keep bringing money in. So it becomes less about the production of knowledge and more about the production of capital. And it's the same for music. If you go up to the highest, the biggest money, the biggest bands in the world, the biggest DJs, the biggest companies, what are they doing it for? They're not necessarily doing it for the same reasons that the communities you're speaking about do it for. They're doing it because there's an incentive, and there's an incentive to produce a certain type of musician. So a jazz musician in certain places is not commercial, and you're never going to make as much money as a pop musician. There's a reason for that. It's not because your art is less valuable or is lower in any sort of hierarchy. It's genuinely because it's not going to make as much money as pop music these days. It's like when you're talking about capital and you're talking about this kind of change, I don't necessarily agree that there's a clear definition. I don't like thinking about things in terms of pre-capitalist and capitalist. But you're kind of talking about that process of change within music culture. And for me, it's all about, when you're talking about capitalism, it's all about the commodification of labour, the exploitation of labour, how that is organised in the society we live in. Nothing is free of, although we like to think so. And I'm very interested in the ways in which intellectual, creative labour is exploited. And that's another reason for doing the Commons and for trying to produce a different kind of public space, trying to pay bands properly, trying to respect every artist that walks into the space, is because we know that generally they're not respected in the way that they should be. A lot of the time, musicians and DJs are booked because they're going to sell tickets. They're going to bring a crowd in. They're not booked because of the artistry itself. And that's the kind of thing that we want to, myself, Caller, Jenna and Candice, want to try and garner in this space. Obviously we need to make money. That's the problem, is that everyone needs to make cash, but we want to put art and culture first. And we're not the only ones doing it. There's lots of people across the city, across the country, across the world doing it. And we kind of feel like we're following in the footsteps of places like Cafe Ganesh, Tagore's, Straight No Chaser, spaces that really valued musicianship, art, and kind of alternative ways of being in the world. I can't really comment about individual musicians and the motivations for them choosing to put themselves out on a limb. In the same sense, I guess I can only speak from my experience, and there's a certain sense that a musician lives a precarious life, in the same sense that an academic is often placed in the same positions. If you don't get a tenured job, you're on contract for 10 years. It's a precarious position because it could end unless you continue to produce. And I think, the thing that fascinates me about jazz, for example, in this country, and I'm not an expert on this, so I'm not going to speak as if I as if a lot of other people could say a lot more about this than me. But being a foreigner from the UK with not a very strong jazz tradition and coming to South Africa and seeing how integral jazz is, and not just jazz, other genres as well, but I guess jazz is the quintessential one, but seeing how integral it is to struggle, histories of struggle and politics. There's a certain culture around jazz music in South Africa that fascinates me because it was, and I think it still is, so intertwined with kind of politics of refusal, a politics of resistance. Bebop and avant-garde experimental jazz was essentially like a practice of evasion. Yeah, constant experimentation was kind of used as a mode through which to not be captured and trapped, So the experiment itself, the experimental in jazz, was a practice of freedom, you could say. So yeah, I kind of like that about jazz, the jazz tradition, as well as in South Africa it being tied up with struggle, essentially. I mean, the things that I'm starting to think about theoretically are around vinyl and about archive. So I guess in South Africa, every academic, particularly in the arts and the humanities, the question of the archive is everywhere. How to decolonize the archive, how to not reproduce the same representative tropes that it does, how to reclassify it, how to repurpose an archival system that was basically exploitative and violent, and we see the traces of it. But the question, although my focus is not necessarily the archive is always ever present. This question of what to do with it. I definitely feel a need to start to think about other archival practices, and one of them for me is around vinyl culture. So one of the things that I've started to think about and theorise quite a lot since running the Commons and Analog is how DJ culture, vinyl culture, crate digging can be thought of as an alternative archival practice. So if the colonial archive is an archive that houses, orders, segregates, classifies and holds, excludes quite often. Something like vinyl culture, DJ culture, where we all have our own archives, we all have our own collections, we all have our own stories around certain records, certain musicians. We all have memories attached to those things. When DJs who are passionate about music come into a space and share that music, it's quite an interesting process to watch, especially to think in terms of the archive and the ways in which people swap and share and buy and sell and hear something new and go and buy it the next day. So yeah, it's very much in its early stages, but I guess that's where some of my research interests are leading towards, is kind of around vinyl culture and records and digging. What it means to dig through another person's archive and to take and then to share and to play. On the one hand, there's a revival, and a lot of that is associated with hipster culture, bourgeois, global north kind of culture is, in a sense, appropriated the record as something that is cool and something a little bit different. It's interesting that during COVID, vinyl sales globally trebled or quadrupled. Yeah, I mean, I think last year was the most records sold since the CD came out. So there is a massive revival about it. And like I say, a lot of that's associated with hipster culture, cool kind of record collector, blah de blah blah. But I think there's something, the other thing that interested me about records is that unlike the digital, you can pick it up, There's a different relationship with the technology that you have. And I feel I guess in a similar sense that you're trying to get at around music and capitalism, digitization and the virtual, for me, and I think for lots of other people, it alienates us from ourselves and each other. One of the reasons why I came to this space is because academic life for me online is not the same. I feel alienated from my colleagues, I feel isolated from them. And I think that's a similar experience that you get through digital music. If you can just go on YouTube and choose anything, it's great, you can access any music you want, and you can access it in a split second. But there's a different relationship that someone builds with records. It's a material object. You take it out the sleeve, you put it on the record player, you get the needle, put it in the groove and press play. You know, there's a much more intimate, personal relationship that people have with the object and with music. For me, at least, that's a really important aspect of buying and selling and playing and sharing and listening to music on record, is literally that kind of experience that you have with the technology itself. And obviously there's memories attached to each record. I've got a couple of Beatles records at home, and whenever I put them on, it reminds me of my dad, you know, or I'll put Otis Redding on and it will remind me of my mother. You know, there's also kind of a connection through the material object itself. It's something about the material that makes it different to kind of digital, virtual interactions with art or music or whatever it is.